look at pottery and look at the different ways that archaeologists analyze pottery, what it could tell us about past societies, why it's important. And so in previous weeks, we talked a little bit about how pottery is an excellent way to date levels at a site and to also date sites that you might be surveying. If you've studied the pottery of an area well enough, and there's enough background material, you can look at different kinds of pottery lying on the surface of a site. And many sites in the Middle East, the Indus Valley, Egypt, there's pottery all over an archaeological site. So by looking at the pottery, and again, if the pottery's studied well enough previously, you can look at the pottery and say, oh, this dates to this period or this dates to that period. In an archaeological site, typical archaeological site that dates to 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BC, up to the present, you're going to have a lot of pottery. Most of it's going to be broken. This is one of the reasons why pottery is one of the most common artifacts in these kinds of sites, because ceramic is a pretty much indestructible substance, doesn't wear away. But it is fragile, it is brittle, and so pottery breaks and has to be replaced constantly. So you end up with lots and lots of pottery. A lot of work and time is spent analyzing the pottery, looking at the forms and the shapes, looking at the kind of clay and temper that was used, and the technological techniques that were used to manufacture it, what it could tell us about ancient societies. And at the end of an archaeological excavation, you'll usually end up with broken pieces of pottery that can't really be used for anything in a museum. They can't be displayed. They've been studied, right? And so you usually just store them all away. One site I worked on in Turkey, they ended up with 3 tractor trailers full just of pottery. So what is pottery exactly? Well, it's ceramic. Ceramic is one of the first artificial substances created by people. In the video on Ghazal, you heard about lime plaster. Lime plaster was an earlier development in artificial substances. Humans actually creating something that is not found in nature, taking limestone, water, and adding heat. A chemical reaction forms a completely new substance. The same with ceramics. Here you're using clay, firing the clay, and a chemical reaction takes place, breaking down the clay molecules, releasing the water that was bound to the clay molecules, and forming a new substance that is impervious to water. So what is clay exactly? Clay is defined as particles, you can see here, that are much smaller than silt, right, or the very tiniest grains of sand. This you can see is sort of coarse sand, but very, very fine sand. Clay is obviously much smaller. And it's this fact and the ability to hold water molecules between the grains of the clay that gives clay its plasticity, right? And this is, one of its most important characteristics. When it's wet, it's plastic. It can be formed into different shapes. And after it's fired, it remains permanently in that shape. Right? So clay and ceramics is essentially fired clay. Ceramics today are still important, not just for, serving vessels. I mean, most of us still eat on ceramic dishes, but there's high-tech uses for ceramics. You probably know about ceramic magnets. They're very, very powerful, where they're actually taking clay and impregnating it with iron kind of particles, firing it, and it's a very good magnet. Also, the ballistic armor that people wear today, there's usually ceramic plates inserted in the Kevlar, and those ceramic plates are very hard, and they can take the impact of a bullet and shatter, but absorb a lot of the energy and prevent someone from having a lot of injury as a result of a gunshot. Here you can see different time periods. Pottery was developed around the world at different times independently of each other. The first experiments in clay and fire, you can see, took place about 30,000 BC. But you actually don't get ceramic vessels until much, much later. So a lot of archaeologists have looked at potentially finding out the reason why pottery was developed in the first place. And we can already eliminate the idea that pottery was invented at a certain time because that's when people had the technology to produce it. No, it looks like they were experimenting with clay and fire long before they developed pottery. So there must have been some other kind of push or incentive. And it might have had something to do with the uses of pottery. So pottery has, the different pottery vessels have many different kinds of uses. Here you can, and you may have heard this expression before. It was stated by Louis B. Sullivan, who was a famous architect. He was the teacher of Frank Lloyd Wright. This quote is usually attributed to him: form follows function. It's not 100% true in archaeology, but it is true a lot of the times. Form does seem to follow function when it comes to pottery, or certain aspects of pottery. Certain shapes of vessels are very good at certain things and not good at other things. So this is an amphora, this kind of shaped vessel. It was used in the classical world, Greece and Rome. And you can look at its design, very pointy base, narrow opening there. This is very good for transporting liquids, right? That narrow opening allows you to seal it up, prevent the liquids from coming out. This would not be so good for dried stuff like grain. If you've ever had a storage container, imagine storing rice in a Coke bottle, an empty Coke bottle, and then trying to dispense the rice. It's not that easy, right? Typically, if you want to store rice, you store it in some sort of like a Tupperware container where you can pour it out more easily. Liquids, on the other hand, tend to do much better in vessels where you have a constricted opening like so. These amphora were well designed to transport on ship, so they fit inside the ship's hull in the bottom very well, and were an efficient use of space. The point at the bottom allowed people to pivot this amphora and turn it and place it in different directions, so it was well designed for its use. And so one of the things that you're going to do in your little exercise is determining the shapes of vessels from only a portion of the vessel that remains, what we usually call a sherd, or fragment of the original vessel. And different shapes are good for certain things, right? So, for example, a bowl like this would be good for serving. A jar like this would be good for storing something like liquids because it's got a constricted base or constricted opening. A jar like this with a larger opening would be excellent for cooking. You don't want to cook in something like this because as the steam and pressure builds up, it's going to shoot out of that opening like a volcano, right? You want something like this. Well, how do you tell the difference between a bowl and a jar? This is one of the things that you're going to do. Bowls tend to be flared open like so, right? These are all bowls. Jars tend to be constricted. The opening is kind of inward. The rim kind of angles inward. It might flare out again at the end, but the shape of the overall vessel is one towards going inwards, forming inwards, in order to form a smaller opening than the widest part of the vessel. With a bowl, the widest part of the ceramic is the opening. In a jar, it isn't, right? So these are one of the ways, or some of the ways that you can tell the difference between a jar and a bowl. Now, jars can be used, again, for cooking, for storage and transport of liquids. They can also be used for storage and transport of other goods. Now, these are very large storage jars from the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete. And you can see very, very large and very good for storing things like grain and other things like that. So transportation of liquids, storage, right? What are some other uses of pottery? Well, cooking, like we talked about before. This is, you can see some of the burning and sooting here on the outside of this vessel. Cooking vessels tend to be on the thicker side, right? Sort of medium thickness. They're usually not what we would call fine. They're not very thin-walled because they need to withstand the heat on the fire. They usually have a good bit of temper. We're going to talk about temper, what it is, but the inclusions are added to the clay, right? If you have sand added to the clay, it will help it withstand heat a little bit more. And so this is a good kind of cooking pot that you would find in North America. It happens to come from North Carolina, but this is the kind of cooking vessel that native North Americans would have used. And you can see, again, the sooting over here. Cooking vessels usually don't have a lot of decoration either, right? They're very utilitarian in their in the way they look. Here's some other cooking vessels. You can see that here, this part of the vessel is resting right on top of the coals of the fire, and the sooting is all around that part that didn't get the sooting. You can see here, but this is obviously a cooking vessel. This was a cooking vessel that was probably suspended above a fire. You can have vessels that are used for serving, right? So this is a cup, pretty thin-walled. You can see the striations here that show that it was made on a wheel. It's pretty finely made, and so it would be, and it's you couldn't store anything in it, right? You can't really store things in bowls because they're not protected. The mouth is wide open. So typically a cup, and a bowl are something that you would serve out of. Here are some really, really fine serving vessels you can see here. There's also ritual uses. So this is actually an incense burner. You could have incense on the inside. The smoke will come out of these materials here. So what are some of the uses then? Cooking, storage, other kinds of food preparation, serving, transportation of things like liquids, also ritual use, and trade items themselves. Sometimes ceramics are actually items of trade. Right? So you're going to be analyzing some vessels from a Hopewell site, and you're going to be looking at the thickness, whether it's a jar or a bowl, the size of the opening, kind of decoration, and based on that, you're going to try and figure out what those vessels were most likely used for, and then by extension, what that part of the site was most likely used for, right? So cooking pots tend to be kind of big, hardy vessels, not really well, decorated very much, used for cooking. Serving vessels tend to be more fine, maybe decorated, right? They when you're presenting something to somebody, you want that vessel to look good. There are different kinds of clay as well, or different ceramics that are produced by the coarseness of the clay particles. So porcelain has the smallest particles. Terracotta has, on average, larger clay particles, and also firing temperature. You can produce different varieties. Now, thin vessels are harder to produce than thick vessels, right? But let's look at some of the types of ceramics that can be produced. Terracotta, this is the basic flower pot that you would find in a store, used for roof tiles and things like that. It's fairly porous compared to a lot of the other ceramics. It's not highly fired. Earthenware is a little bit more fired. It's a little less porous, but it's a lot like the terracotta, just sort of a step up from that. Stoneware is usually pretty highly fired. It's kind of has an appearance of stone, which is why it's called stoneware. It is vitrified because of the high temperatures, which means that sand particles in the clay melt and turn essentially into glass. A step up from there is china and then porcelain. These are usually reserved, this kind of clay, for fine serving vessels, right? A lot of people talk about their grandmother's china set, right? Or porcelain, which is the best, the hardest to make, the most expensive. It takes the most skill to use and to make, and it's used for a variety of really high-end purposes. So you would not use your fine porcelain for everyday use. You'd probably eat off your stoneware, and you'd bring out the good china when guests were over, in ancient times and today as well. Okay, so if we look at a place like the Middle East, can we figure out what ancient pottery was used for? So let's take a little look at that.